Welcome to Impact Makers Radio, featuring industry thought leaders sharing problem-solving insights to help grow your business and live the life you love. And here's your host, Stewart Andrew Alexander.
Hi, and welcome to another Let's Talk Divorce conversation. And during this segment of the show, I have family law attorney J. Stephen Anderson, commonly known to his colleagues and friends simply as Steve, who is the founder of J. Stephen Anderson Law Firm and is calling in all the way from Memphis, Tennessee. Now, Steve, who has a wealth of experience in the area of family law, will be talking to you today about why premarital agreements are the best tools to avoid nightmare divorce and probate scenarios. Now, that sounds like a really important and interesting topic. So, if you are one of the increasing numbers of divorcing couples in the Memphis, Tennessee area, and you feel that you can relate to today's topic, you might just want to take a break. Log out of Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or anything else you happen to be doing that which may cause a distraction. You may even want to grab a notepad and pen and take some notes as we listen in to what Steve has to share with us today. So, with that said, let's not keep him waiting any longer. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Well, thank you, Stuart. Thank you for having me today.
You are so welcome, Steve. So let's just jump feet first in and let's get started. Briefly, in your own words, Steve, can you describe the kinds of people who you serve and the various types of situations they find themselves in when they come to you for your help?
Sure, Stuart. In my divorce practice, I am helping people who are going through that difficult process of divorce, and that is often the most difficult thing that they have been through in their life so far. It can be the kind of experience that is so hurtful to people that when they get married again, they insist on having a premarital agreement because they come to understand through their experiences and conversations and general life experience that a premarital agreement can be such an important tool to avoid the kind of difficult times that they've been through in the past. So in the part of my practice that involves creating those premarital agreements for people who are planning marriage, often for a second or third time, often, though, for a first time, I help those people avoid a lot of the present anxiety and misunderstanding that they are going through and dealing with at the time. They're asking themselves, what's going to happen if this marriage doesn't work out? Or what if it ends as badly as my last marriage? Can I go through that again? Is it going to cost me as much money as that cost me? I help those people avoid these potential problems and expenses and regrets in the future, both for themselves and for their children. A premarital agreement is as much of an estate planning tool as it is a family law issue. It's about preservation of wealth, and it's about preservation of relationships and preservation of your psychological and emotional well-being. And those are the people I help. I should mention you can also do post-marital agreements, which address the same issues as premarital agreements. Post-marital agreements can often avoid divorces or at least lessen the negative impact, just like a premarital agreement can.
Right, Steve. So before we go any further, it must be said that anything you share with us from this point on is not legal advice or legal assistance. It's purely for the purpose of sharing information. Now, with that said then, Steve, while you're out there helping these divorcing couples, I'm sure you come across many misconceptions. Now, of all the misconceptions, those untruths, those myths that you come across, which is the most common misconception you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis?
Stuart, the most common misconception that I hear is that you don't need a premarital agreement unless you expect a marriage to fail. I hear that from so many people, and it's simply not true. It's like saying you don't need to wear a seatbelt when you're traveling in a car unless you expect to be in a horrible car crash. If you really believed that a horrible car crash was inevitable, you probably would never get in the car in the first place. And if you believed that a car crash was inevitable and you were going to get in the car anyway, you would be a fool not to use the seatbelt.
Absolutely.
There are billions of people who ride in cars every day. The smart ones use seatbelts to protect themselves and to protect their children and their loved ones. A bad divorce is like a car crash. Once it starts, you lose control of what's happening around you. Other people come in and begin to control your life. It's an adversarial process. A good premarital agreement acts like those automatic braking systems and steering systems that help to avoid a crash on modern cars. They help you control the damage of a divorce. It's like an insurance policy. So saying that you don't need a premarital agreement because you love your fiance, your betrothed, and you would never get divorced, or even if you did get divorced, that it would not be bad because they're going to take care of you or you're going to take care of them is simply not good logic.
Okay, Steve. So based on what you just shared with us and keeping your client's confidentiality in mind, please share an example of how you've helped someone who came to you with that challenge, with those misconceptions you just described, and what kind of transformational results you were able to gain for them.
Sure, I'll be happy to tell you about a recent example I had where a young woman came to me. She did not want to come talk to me about a premarital agreement. She was engaged to a nice young man that she had dated for several years. They had known each other for quite a while. He had a good job. She worked with her father and her brother in a very successful family business. And the father was in the process of his succession planning of the business. He was transferring ownership to both of his children. And he was doing this over a period of years because he couldn't simply give them that much value and stock in any one year. So this transfer process was taking a long time. The young lady was about to be married. The father wanted his daughter to have a premarital agreement. She came to me and said, look, I don't want to ask my fiance to sign a premarital agreement. He's going to think that that means I don't believe in him or the marriage, or he's going to think that I don't appreciate what he is bringing to the marriage. And so I sat down and I talked to her about the advantages of a premarital agreement and how it works and how it's a fairly simple way to deal with a lot of problems that can happen in the event that the marriage doesn't work out. I answered all of her questions. She gained a better understanding of the wisdom of having a premarital agreement, and I even gave her some suggestions on how to approach the subject of signing this premarital agreement with her fiancé, a way that she could talk to him about this without him being threatened or becoming defensive. Of course, he had no problem with signing it. As it turned out, my client was very happy to have addressed some of these issues and resolved these potential problems that she didn't even consider before we met. Her father was very happy and much more eager to welcome his new son-in-law into the family, knowing that his succession plan for the business was intact, and that his legacy, or what he felt was his legacy, was preserved.
Okay then, Steve, just as a reminder for our listeners today, our topic is why premarital agreements are the best tools to avoid nightmare divorce and probate scenarios. Now, with that in mind, Steve, and for those divorcing couples who are out there listening in right now and they're wanting to know more, in your experience, what's the most common but unknown pitfall that they need to keep in mind regardless of what situation they find themselves in?
Well, there's a couple of things, Stewart. One of the pitfalls that a premarital agreement can really handle well is more of a probate issue than it is a divorce issue, and that is dealing with what we call an elective share. This is an issue that arises when one spouse dies during the marriage, and it becomes an especially important situation where someone that already has children has entered into a new marriage. The person who's entered into this second marriage may not be concerned about an eventual divorce, but they should be concerned about what their children will inherit from them when they die. Most people believe that they can settle everything with a will, as long as that will clearly states what your children are going to get and what your surviving spouse will get when you die. But what a lot of people don't realize is that regardless of what your will says, your surviving spouse could demand what they call an elective share, which is a share of your estate, usually about a third, but as high as 40% in some states. It's a share of your estate that your surviving spouse can get no matter what your will says, even if your will says that they get less than that. An example is a husband leaves $1 million life insurance policy to his wife to take care of her when he dies, and then he leaves the rest of his estate, let's say it's worth $5 million, to his 5 kids from his first marriage. Now, the wife will get that $1 million from the life insurance policy, and if she chooses to take an elective share against his will, then she can get a percentage of the $5 million that was intended for the children also. Some states apply the elective share to what they call an augmented estate, which would take the $1 million that the wife got from the insurance into account when they divide it up, or they allow her elective share. But whatever the situation, if a surviving spouse takes this elective share, regardless of what your will says, she's going to get some additional money that you did not intend her to get. So that's probably the thing that I explained to many people when we were having a discussion about premarital agreements that they did not understand at all. And a premarital agreement can effectively waive that right to an elective share, and it can waive many other rights that people don't understand attach as a result of marriage. One other pitfall that people need to keep in mind is, in the event of a divorce, alimony issues that they face and how uncertain those are when you get into a divorce process. In Memphis, Tennessee, where I practice divorce, there are 12 judges that hear divorces, 12 different personalities that make decisions about how your property is going to be divided and what kind of spousal support or alimony that you are going to have to pay in the event of a divorce. And depending on which judge you get, may have a different outlook on what your potential liability is for paying alimony, let's say. One thing that a premarital agreement can do is limit your liability. It can take the liability away completely. You can waive the right to alimony, or you can at least limit it. Much like an insurance policy, it limits your liability in the case that you're in a bad accident. You can have a cap, or you can eliminate any liability at all, and you get to take care of this negotiation at a time when you and your spouse-to-be are getting along well, before the animosity and anger of a divorce situation sets in.
Well, Steve, you've shared some great insights so far. So I just want to, before we move on, just thank you for digging so deep and just sharing those great tips. It's going to be really useful for our listeners. So moving on then, Steve, let me just ask you, how long have you been practicing family law? Just briefly, how many years?
34 years, since 1983.
Since 1983. So would it be safe to say that you have helped hundreds of people within that 33-year span of time?
Yes, absolutely. I've had hundreds of clients and cases, and I like to think that I help some other people that are ancillary to my clients themselves, oftentimes the children of my clients.
With that said then, Steve, let's just imagine it's any day of the week. It's a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, it doesn't really matter. And your alarm clock goes off at 6, 7 a.m. in the morning, and you're waking up with a full day's work ahead of you, helping those people who find themselves in the unfortunate position of either facing a divorce or looking at a premarital agreement, whatever the case may be. After 33 years and helping hundreds of people, possibly even thousands of people, how do you feel on a day like that, Steve? Are you still motivated?
Oh, absolutely. I enjoy coming to work in the morning. I always like to start the day facing a challenge, trying to resolve that challenge in favor of my client, hopefully making my client as happy as they can be made in a divorce situation. It's sometimes difficult to do when I'm negotiating or drafting or advising clients with regard to a premarital agreement. They are more often very happy with the end result because they have a better sense of some limits to liability in the future. They've got a sense of relief that they don't have to worry about these things in the future. And frankly, removing those kind of stressors from a relationship, I think probably makes it a lot more likely that a marriage will endure when people aren't worried about, well, what might happen in the event things start not working out, because a lot of times those kind of stress factors contribute to the breakup of a marriage.
So, Steve, within 33 years, you must have seen many cases where what I call the hidden victims are negatively impacted by a divorce. And I'm speaking, obviously, about the children. Now, one of the reasons why, or the main reason why I started this series of Let's Talk Divorce is to bring on professionals like yourself so that you could share your expertise, share your experience, in the hope that divorcing couples out there listening in who are in that unfortunate position of facing divorce, but who are also at loggerheads with each other. There's a lot of stress, there's a lot of drama, there's fighting, there's a lot of anxiety, and unfortunately the children are being caught up in the middle. This is the main reason for this show, because my goal is that any consumer, any listener listening in may, in the hope, just change their perspective, change their perception, change the way how they're communicating with each other, and put the children first. I'm speaking from personal experience. I'm a child of divorce myself. My parents went through a very volatile, a very violent divorce. There was lots of fighting, there was lots of arguments, lots of blood, and I witnessed that as a young child. And I was powerless and grew up blaming myself for my parents' breakup because I never understood. And back in those days, you never had the kind of resources available to divorcing couples. So we're talking 1978, 1979. There were no collaborators and mediators and all the amazing resources and people like yourselves available back in those days. So with that said then, Steve, and this message is going out to the listener, but through the listeners to those children, those invisible voices, what would you say to those divorcing couples who do find themselves literally at each other's throat? What would you say to them, keeping in mind that the children are the most important people in scenarios like this?
Well, what I would say to people going through divorces that have children, especially these high conflict divorces, where you get a lot of the volatility and the anger that you unfortunately experienced as a child, or you witnessed as a child, I tell these people that they need to remember that it's not all about them.
Right.
That the arguments that they tend to concentrate on and focus on and not be able to let go of are often about material things. And I try to remind them that your children are young, your children are experiencing this, and they do not have the perspective and the emotional maturity and the experience to process this the same way that adults do. And they need to make sure that they don't let material goals interfere with doing what is best for their children. In Tennessee, parents of children that are going through divorce are required to take a class that's about children coping with divorce. It's not about the parents. It's about the parents dealing with the children and communicating with the children during the divorce process. And this has been shown to help lessen the impact of the divorce on the children, or the negative impact of the divorce on the children. And it's been shown to help the parents realize and to keep in mind that they are not the only ones going through the divorce. The children are going through the divorce also. Some parents get more out of these classes than others. But, bless you, Stewart, for having suffered through that and survived that experience, and for using that experience to help others address those issues.
It's such an important point, not just for myself personally, but for the listeners who listen in to my show. You've heard me say it before. I'm 55 years old now, but it took me over 2 decades to deal with the psychological fallout, for lack of a better term, of being caught up in the middle of feuding parents. My mother talking bad about my father and vice versa, and all of the fighting. And it's just, as a child, you pick up every single nuance. You may not feel that the child is not picking that up as a parent, but I'm telling you from my own personal experience, you pick it up, you process it, and because you have no outlet, you internalize that, and most kids of divorce end up blaming themselves, and they carry that into adulthood, and it has an effect on the decisions they make in life. It had an effect on my schoolwork, it had an effect on my exams, it had an effect on the jobs that I took, it had an effect on the relationships that I went into. So why Steve and I are just really making a point about this is it's really important, and we totally understand the situation that you find in yourself. Your partner may have cheated on you. You may have every right to be angry and to have all this anxiety, but you must love your children more than you love yourselves and put them first. So, I just want to thank Steve for coming along with us. We're not finished yet. I've still got a couple of questions, but I just want to take this moment out just to thank Steve for coming along and sharing that great insight, what he just shared with you, because it's 100% true. Take that from somebody who has experienced divorce as a child and experienced the fallout as an adult, and how long it took to process that. And still, these days, it still comes up, it still rears its ugly head in some situations. So be mindful of the situation that you're in out there, parents, please do. So with that said, Steve shared a lot of great information today. He's talked about some of the misconceptions, some of those untruths that divorcing couples like yourself believe to be true, and how he dispels those misconceptions. And he's also shared some great tips on some of the pitfalls that you need to be aware of, and especially a great tip about elective share. That's something I've never heard about myself. So let's find out a little bit more about Steve in terms of his background. So Steve, can you just share a few moments, a little bit of information about your background, your formal education, and your experience as it relates to the topic of family law? Now, I'm sure after 33 years, you could talk for at least an hour. So let's just keep it short and just give the listener the opportunity just to get to know a little bit more about you. Thank you, Steve.
Sure. Thank you, Stewart. I was born and raised here in Memphis, Tennessee. I went to a little school in Jackson, Tennessee, not far from here, called Lambeth College. I attended University of Memphis Law School, graduated from there in 1983, very early on in that practice, I began to concentrate on family law. And I saw all of these problems that people were facing in divorce, as we talked about before, the arguing and the pain and the money that is just wasted on lawyers because people are making decisions about how to divide their property and what amount of alimony they may need or think they deserve, while the other side is looking at what amount of alimony they think they can pay. They were dealing with complex laws about division of marital property and spousal support that they may not understand. They may think is unfair even when they do understand it, because these laws are sort of one size fits all. And I began to see them dealing with those decisions in an atmosphere of confusion and anger and distrust, sometimes even hatred. And it's just a poor time to be making those decisions. And it became more and more clear to me that you need to plan on how to deal with these kind of issues while you're still getting along, before you're going through a divorce. You need to set up this insurance policy, which gives you some expectation of what will happen in the event of divorce before you hate each other, because that's a horrible time to negotiate. And so I got into a little more than you asked there, Stewart. I apologize. But that's how long I've been doing this. I've been concentrating, or really have been intrigued with premarital agreements as a way to lessen the negative impacts of divorce for the last 20, 25 years. I've started doing them more and more, and I teach seminars to other lawyers about premarital agreements, and I write articles about premarital agreements, and I just really think they're an excellent tool.
Okay, so thanks again for that, Steve. Just for a moment, Steve, can you just briefly picture those kinds of people who come to you for your help and they're wanting to know more about premarital agreements and why they are the best tools to avoid nightmare divorce and probate scenarios? With that picture in mind then, Steve, what would be your final thoughts, your best tips, your best insights before we close out with our last question for today?
Okay, Stewart, that's an excellent question. The number one tip I have, if you are thinking about getting married, don't be afraid to talk about a premarital agreement with the person that you're planning on spending the rest of your life with. Especially if you have assets you want to protect. Absolutely, if you have children from a prior marriage or a prior relationship, you should at least talk with a lawyer first, and then you need to talk with this person that you love and you want to marry. If you cannot communicate with them at this point about the issues that a premarital agreement deals with, then you might want to consider whether or not you really need to marry them. This is going to be a much easier conversation than some of the conversations that are inevitable in every marriage that you're going to face in the future. No matter how much you're going to have to work out in the premarital agreement, the complex issues during your marriage are going to lead to some more complex conversations. As I mentioned earlier, statistically, more than half of the marriages in the United States end in divorce. So it's simply sticking your head in the sand not to at least have a conversation about a premarital agreement before you get married.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Steve. So if there is somebody out there who wants to know more about what we've been speaking about today, how can they reach out to you? Where would they find you?
Well, in Tennessee, you can simply call my telephone number, which is area code 901-763-1800. I have a web page at www.jsandersonlaw.com. You can email me. It's Steve, Steve, at jsandersonlaw.com. Or if you're listening to this and you can't write this down, you can just Google J, the initial J, Stephen, with a V, Steven, Anderson, attorney, and I'm going to pop up, and you can get in touch with me that way.
Fantastic. Well, that's all we have time for today. Once more, that was family law attorney Stephen Anderson. Thank you so much for sharing so generously with us today, Steve. You have certainly demonstrated that you are a true educator and advocate for your client's success. So thank you.
You're very welcome, and thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to be able to talk to you today.
You're so welcome, Steve. And I'd also like to say a big thank you to you, the listener. It's unfortunate if you do find yourself in that position where you're looking at divorce, or, maybe it's not so bad if you're looking at a premarital agreement. Whatever the case may be, thank you for joining us on this very, what I can only describe as an insightful and informative discussion with one of the top family law attorneys in Memphis, Tennessee today. Again, his name was Stephen Anderson from the J. Stephen Anderson Law Firm. Make sure you do check him out, give him a call, send him an email. I am absolutely sure that you're going to be in good hands. So again, folks, that's it for today. My name is Stewart Andrew Alexander, and we'll be back shortly with some more leading family law professionals in this, our series of Let's Talk Divorce Conversations. So, until then, take care, have a great day, and we'll talk real soon.
Thank you for tuning in to Impact Makers Radio. To listen to all past, present and future industry thought leaders and trendsetters, visit us at impactmakersradio.com.